In 1996, a man posed for a magazine cover wearing an ammo belt across his chest. He was 59 years old. He ran a small appliance company in Florida. The magazine called him Rambo in pinstripes. Wall Street called him a genius. The workers at his factories called him Chainsaw Al. By the time the photo ran, Albert Dunlap had already fired more than 11,000 people at a single company. He had made himself $100 million doing it. He had sold the wreckage to Kimberly-Clark for $9.4 billion, written a best-selling book about his methods, and become the most famous turnaround executive in America. 2 years later, he would do it all again at Sunbeam. A year after that, the Securities and Exchange Commission would ban him from running a public company for the rest of his life. That part of the story has been told. What almost no one knew, not the magazine, not the shareholders, not the board that hired him at Sunbeam, not the board that hired him at Scott Paper, was that this was not the first time Albert Dunlap had inflated a balance sheet and walked away rich. It was not the second time. It was the third. 20 years earlier, at a paper mill in Niagara Falls, he had already perfected the con, and everyone just looked the other way. Niagara Falls, New York, 1974. Nitec was a paper mill, small, regional, struggling, the kind of company that hires an ambitious executive with a hard reputation and tells him to fix it. Albert Dunlap was 36 years old. He had spent more than a decade climbing through the paper industry, building a reputation for cutting costs and not flinching when people lost their jobs. Nitec made him president. For 2 years, on paper, he turned the company around. In 1976, Nitec reported a profit of $5 million. It was the best year in the company's history. The board, by then exhausted by his abrasive style, fired him anyway. They had what they needed. The numbers were good. Then Arthur Young arrived. Arthur Young, the accounting firm that would later become part of Ernst & Young, was brought in to audit the books after Dunlap's departure. They found inventory on the ledger that did not exist. They found revenue from sales that had never happened. They found, when they were finished, that Nitec's $5 million profit was actually a $5.5 million loss. The turnaround was a fiction. A Nitec vice president would later testify under oath that Dunlap had personally ordered him to report the misleading figures. Nitec sued Dunlap for fraud. The legal fight dragged on for years. By the time it was over, the company itself was gone. The restated losses, the lawsuit, and the operational damage that the fake numbers had been hiding combined to push the paper mill into bankruptcy. Nitec ceased to exist. Dunlap walked away. He did not pay damages. He did not face criminal charges. He took a series of executive roles at other companies, rebuilding a respectable resume one position at a time. On every resume that followed, every executive search profile, every magazine bio, every introduction at every shareholder meeting, he left Nitec off. For the next 18 years, no one knew. 18 years later, Albert Dunlap was a different man. Or so it appeared. By the spring of 1994, Scott Paper was bleeding. The company had lost $277 million the previous year. Its stock was stuck. Its brands, Scott Tissue, Cottonelle, Scott Towels, were still the best-selling paper goods in the world. But its factories were aging, its bureaucracy was bloated, and its executives had run out of ideas. The board went looking for someone willing to do what the existing leadership wouldn't. They hired Dunlap. He arrived in May. Within 90 days, he had a plan. Within 12 months, he had executed almost all of it. 11,200 people lost their jobs. That was roughly 45% of Scott Paper's entire workforce. He cut more than 70% of senior management. He eliminated 71% of the headquarters staff. He shut down 60 warehouses and reopened 19 of them. He sold off Scott's energy division, its Mexican joint ventures, its healthcare and food service operations, its printing and writing paper business. In 9 months, he divested more than $2 billion in assets. By the end of 1994, Scott Paper reported a $200 million profit from a $277 million loss the year before. The stock more than doubled. Then it doubled again. Within 18 months of Dunlap's arrival, Scott's share price had risen 225%. Wall Street called it a miracle. In late 1995, Dunlap sold Scott Paper to Kimberly-Clark for $9.4 billion. He'd been in the job 20 months. His personal payout, including salary, stock options, and the appreciation of his holdings, came to roughly $100 million. He was a national figure, and he was just getting started. The following year, while still riding the publicity from the Scott Paper deal, Dunlap published a book. He called it Mean Business: How I Save Bad Companies and Make Good Companies Great. It read as a manifesto: cut deep, cut fast, cut once. A corporation exists for one reason: to make money for its shareholders. Employees were not stakeholders. Communities were not stakeholders. There was no social contract. There was only the stock price. This was not Dunlap's invention. The economist Milton Friedman had famously argued in 1970 that a corporation's only social responsibility was to increase its profits. The idea became one of the most influential doctrines in American business. Dunlap was simply the executive who applied it without exception. When Newsweek ran a cover story on the human cost of corporate layoffs, Dunlap contributed a column celebrating them. The book sold. Dunlap toured. Business schools assigned chapters, magazines profiled him. He posed for the ammo belt photograph. He became the most famous turnaround executive in America. And then, slowly, the executives at Kimberly-Clark started to figure out what they had actually bought. The factories Dunlap had handed them were in worse shape than the financials suggested. He had cut plant and equipment maintenance to almost nothing. He had slashed research and development. He had sold off the parts of the business that produced future revenue and pocketed the cash as present-day profit. Kimberly-Clark would spend the next several years and hundreds of millions of dollars repairing the damage. A Businessweek writer named John Byrne, who would later write the definitive book on Dunlap, put it this way: he had run Scott's factories as if the company were going out of business. From his perspective, it was. He was being paid to sell it. It was Nitec again. Inflated assets, hollowed-out operations, a turnaround that wasn't. The only difference was the scale and the audience. At Nitec, an auditor caught him in 18 months. At Scott Paper, an acquirer caught him after closing. And by then, it didn't matter. Dunlap had his $100 million. The shareholders had their stock gains. The press had its hero. Everyone who had been paid had been paid. The 11,200 people who lost their jobs were not consulted. 2 months after the Kimberly-Clark deal closed, Dunlap got a phone call from the board of a struggling small appliance company in Florida. They had read the book. They had seen the stock chart. They wanted to know if he would do for Sunbeam what he had done for Scott Paper. He said yes. Sunbeam was a brand most Americans had grown up with. Coffee makers, blenders, electric blankets, outdoor grills. By the mid-1990s, it was also a brand most Americans had stopped buying. The product lines were tired. The factories were old. The board had spent the previous year trying quietly to sell the company. There had been no takers. In July 1996, Sunbeam announced it had hired Albert Dunlap as chairman and chief executive officer. The stock jumped 50% the same day. He had not yet visited a Sunbeam factory. He had not yet met a Sunbeam employee. The market didn't care. He had become a one-man arbitrage opportunity. Hire Dunlap, watch the stock pop, sell into the strength. Sunbeam's largest shareholder, a mutual fund manager named Michael Price, had been quietly arranging the hire for months. He had read the book. He had seen the Scott Paper chart. He believed, with reason, that Dunlap could engineer the same kind of acquisition exit. Within 4 months, Dunlap announced his plan. 6,000 of Sunbeam's 12,000 employees would be cut. 18 of the company's 26 factories would close. 87% of the product line would be eliminated. The corporate charity program was cancelled, and by the end of 1996, the playbook from Scott Paper was running again, faster, deeper, and more aggressive. By the end of 1997, Sunbeam reported a record-setting profit of $189 million. The stock hit $52 a share. Dunlap declared the turnaround complete. There was only one problem. He couldn't find a buyer. Scott Paper had worked because Kimberly-Clark had been willing to pay $9.4 billion for it. Sunbeam in 1997 was supposed to follow the same arc: engineer the numbers, attract an acquirer, take the payout, and exit. But no one came. Procter & Gamble passed, other suitors looked and walked away. The companies that knew the consumer appliance business knew from their own diligence that Sunbeam was not what its financials claimed. So Dunlap kept going, and the real-world numbers started to fall apart. He had been padding them all along. The SEC would later document the techniques in detail. Cookie jar reserves. Dunlap had charged enormous restructuring losses to 1996, larger than the actual restructuring required, then quietly released the excess into 1997 earnings to manufacture the appearance of a recovery. Channel stuffing. Sunbeam offered retailers steep discounts to take inventory they did not want, booking the sales in the current quarter and pushing the consequences into the next one. Bill and hold. Sunbeam booked sales of products that were still sitting in third-party warehouses, not yet shipped to any customer. At year-end 1997, the first quarter of 1998 was extended by 2 days, March 29th to March 31st, to capture additional revenue. At least $60 million of Sunbeam's reported 1997 income, about a third of it, came from accounting fraud. On March 3rd, 1998, with the first quarter already cracking, Dunlap announced that Sunbeam would acquire 3 other consumer products companies in a single day: Coleman, the camping gear maker; Signature Brands, the maker of Mr. Coffee; and First Alert, the smoke detector manufacturer. The stock jumped 9%. Within 2 days, it hit an all-time high of $52. The SEC would later allege that these acquisitions had been arranged in part to camouflage Sunbeam's deteriorating numbers, 3 new sets of books to muddy the picture before anyone could see it clearly. 2 people saw it clearly. The first was a 26-year-old internal auditor named Deidre Dendanto. She had been at Sunbeam only a short time when she identified what was happening. She raised the issues internally. Her supervisors gave her no support. She resigned on April 3, 1998. The second was an analyst at Payne Webber named Andrew Shaw. He had noticed something in the public filings. Inventory and accounts receivable were climbing in patterns that did not match Sunbeam's reported sales. In May 1998, he confronted Dunlap directly. According to multiple accounts, Dunlap grabbed him by the shoulder. "You son of a bitch," he said. "I'll come after you twice as hard." Shaw came after him anyway. By early June, Sunbeam's outside directors had hired their own investigators. What they found was bad enough that on June 13, 1998, they fired Albert Dunlap. He had been at Sunbeam less than 2 years. The Securities and Exchange Commission filed charges against Albert Dunlap on May 15, 2001. The settlement, when it came, was permanent. Dunlap was banned for life from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company in the United States. He paid a $500,000 personal fine to the government and $15 million out of his own pocket to settle the shareholder class action lawsuit. He never admitted wrongdoing. He blamed the auditors. Sunbeam itself never recovered. The company filed for bankruptcy in 2001 and was eventually absorbed by what is now Newell Brands. The more than 17,000 people Dunlap had laid off across Scott Paper and Sunbeam did not get their jobs back. The pension obligations were restructured. The communities around those closed factories took years, in some cases decades, to recover. Dunlap retired to Florida. He kept his houses. He kept his art collection. He donated $20 million to Florida State University. He died at home in 2019 at the age of 81, never having paid a meaningful price for any of it. In 2011, the British journalist John Ronson published a book called The Psychopath Test. One chapter was devoted to Dunlap, whom Ronson visited at his Florida estate. Ronson walked him through the standard clinical checklist of psychopathic traits: grandiosity, manipulativeness, lack of remorse, shallow affect, and Dunlap, item by item, recast each one as a feature. The traits clinicians use to diagnose psychopathy, he argued, were the traits that had made him a successful executive. And here's what almost no one says out loud. Albert Dunlap was not a man who slipped through the cracks. The system didn't fail to catch him. The system rewarded him for 2 decades for doing exactly what he openly said he was doing. The 50% stock pop the morning Sunbeam announced his hire was the market telling itself the truth. Hiring Albert Dunlap was a signal that a company was about to be liquidated for parts. That was the value. That was the trade. The workers were a rounding error. The communities were not in the equation. The auditor caught him at Nitec, the buyer caught him at Scott Paper, the SEC caught him at Sunbeam. 3 different mechanisms, 20 years apart, each catching the same fraud, and not one of them ever stopped the system that kept hiring him. Within 3 years of Dunlap's SEC settlement, Enron, WorldCom, and Tyco would all collapse on accounting frauds of their own. Different mechanics, same logic. Manufactured earnings, hidden losses, executives walking away with hundreds of millions while the rank and file lost their jobs and their pensions. Dunlap wasn't the exception, he was the prototype. Somewhere, right now, on a partner track at a private equity firm or a turnaround consulting practice, there is another Albert Dunlap. He doesn't pose with an ammo belt, he has a better PR team. He calls himself an operator, and his next board interview is already on the calendar.